Were among the most powerful of all the western tribes. More than 200 of their villages dotted the land that is now central Idaho and the eastern corners of Washington and Oregon. It is a land of rugged mountains and great forests, and of foaming rivers plunging through some of America's deepest canyons. But it also has many pleasant open valleys and wide reaches of rolling grasslands. These people call themselves Namapu, which means simply, we people. It was the early French trappers, along in the 1790s, who gave them the name Nez Perce, which means pierced nose. Actually, they did not follow the practice of piercing their noses and inserting bright shells or pebbles, as some Northwest Indians did. The French pronunciation of Nez Perce was later dropped by the English-speaking settlers who called them Nez Perce. In 1805, the estimated population of this tribe was about 6,000 persons. The tribe was divided into 6 bands. The different bands were called by the name of the river or the area of the country from which they came. There were the Salmon River, Clearwater, Lapway, Kamaya, Warawas, Snake, and Seven Devils. Each band was led by its own chiefs. The Nez Perce owned horses long before the white man came to their country. The first ones came from their southern neighbors, the Shoshones, and were descendants of the horses brought into New Mexico by the early Spanish conquerors. Of all the Indian tribes in Northwest America, the Nez Perce were the wisest horsemen. As a squaw sorts berries, they sorted and culled their horses. The poorer ones were traded off or used as pack horses. The gentle aged ones became mounts for the old people. But the swift ones, the tough and game ones, these were the buffalo runners, and they had no equal. They were built for rough mountain passes. They could charge into stampeding buffalo and single out one for the kill. Other tribes painted their horses for war and for the chase, but the Nez Perce horses were painted by nature with a curious spattering of spots in clay red or jet black. Some spots were rounded like polka dots, some irregular as leaves, and some elongated like footprints. And so the peaceful Nez Perce lived in security, migrating and hunting by horses, and breeding only the best to the best, until in time their horses were the most distinctive in marking and fleetest of foot in the Pacific Northwest. When white men spied them, they said, "These are the swift runners that graze on the meadows made by the Palouse River." Soon the word Palouse, which means the stream of the green meadows, came to apply to the horses too. Palousi they were called. Even the Indians began speaking of their red and blue Palousis, for most of them were red or blue roans, whitening toward the rump where the spots clustered. Today we call these horses Appaloosas. The Nez Perce took a liking to the white man. They invited them to feast on buffalo meat and white thimbleberries, and they gave them presents of horses. The white men in turn sent missionaries to live among the Nez Perce to teach them reading and writing. The missionaries disapproved of the fast-spotted horses and of the constant warfare with the Blackfeet, so they showed them how to make plows and cultivate the land. They gave them Bible names, calling their elderly chieftain Joseph, and changing the name of his son from Thunder Rolling in the Mountains to Young Joseph. During the 1840s, many more settlers began to pour into Idaho, Washington, and Oregon. They needed land and they took it. And of course it was land that the Indians had always considered theirs. The settlers were often harsh in their dealings with the Indians, and from time to time trouble broke out between them. In 1855, the Nez Perce and other tribes were called to a council meeting on the Walla Walla. They met for several days, and the Treaty of 1855 was drawn up. For his reservation, Old Joseph demanded and received the Wallowa Valley. He refused, however, to receive any of the white man's money or to take any of his gifts, for he was wise enough to see that this might lead to the claim that he had sold his lands. The Indians kept their promises faithfully, even though settlers and cattlemen trespassed upon their reservations. But the final and complete breaking of the treaty came in 1861, when gold was discovered on the Indians' land. Seemingly from nowhere came a new stampede of men, gold rushers who trampled vegetable patches and spoiled pasture land. More settlers came too, jostling the red man, squatting on his land, eyeing his cattle and his horses. Despite all of these problems, the Nez Perce tried to live peacefully with their white neighbors. Meanwhile, far away in the capital city of the United States, greedy fingers pointed across the continent and voices blustered. We must move the Nez Perce to a reservation. Then agents came to the valley saying, this spot is now too cold for you. You must go away to Idaho. The two Josephs listened, puzzled. By solemn treaty, their people had been given the valley of the winding waters, the Wallowa Valley of Oregon. In 1863, the government of the United States wished to negotiate a new treaty. The other previous treaties had been totally disregarded by the whites, and the Indian lands were being overrun by miners and white squatters. The new treaty forced the Nez Perce to cede great portions of the land which had been guaranteed them under the first treaty of 1855. Part of the land to be ceded was the Wallowa country, which belonged to the band of Old Chief Joseph. Old Joseph refused to cede his land or to sign the new treaty. The chiefs of the bands who would lose no new land urged all of the chiefs to sign the treaty. 4 of the chiefs and their bands refused to sign, and this ended the Federation of the Nez Perce. Thereafter, the Nez Perce were split into 2 factions, one known as the Treaty Nez Perce and the other as the non-treaty group. The non-treaty group refused to accept any government money or help, or to recognize that their lands had been ceded by the Treaty of 1863. In 1871, Old Joseph died, and his son young Joseph took over as chief of the band who lived in the Wallowas. For 6 years, Joseph was able to keep his promise to his father that he would not leave the land of the Wallowas. In 1877, the Nez Perce were ordered to go to Fort Lapway to meet with General Howard and his staff. The 6 bands met and rode in together. This included all of the bands of the treaty and non-treaty Nez Perce. All of the bands were in agreement and chose young Chief Joseph to be their leader and lead them into council with the whites. General Howard informed Chief Joseph that he and his people had to leave their land of the Wallawas and move on to the reservation at Lapwai. He would give them only 30 days to obey, or his troops would go to war with the non-treaty Nez Perce. It was a hard decision for Joseph. He had promised his father, old Joseph, that he would never give up the land of the Wallawas. But he knew that the time had come, and he would have to do what he thought best for his people, even though they might despise him for it. Joseph told the general that his people would try to obey. "30 days to comb 1,000,000 acres of valley and hill, wood and meadowland, creek bottom and cliff, crag and ridge, and drive their cattle and horse herds toward the Snake." For Joseph, the days were frantic. His people raged at him in council. The whites moved in, running off scattered bunches from the range herds. Young colts were taken, and calves carried away. Two weeks had passed, and the big herds of cattle were driven down to the Snake, near the mouth of the Imnaha River. Thousands of head of cattle were lost and stolen on the way. Even Joseph's band, some of the greatest cattlemen of the West, had not been able to stop this loss. The crossing of the Snake began. The river was running high from the heavy spring rains. The water raged, and the men worked furiously to get the people and herds of cattle and horses across. It took them several days, and not one person drowned in that dangerous crossing. But many horses and hundreds of head of cattle had drowned. After the crossing of the Snake, they had to cross the Salmon River. It, too, raged with mountain floods. Finally, the crossing was made. It had taken them 20 days to gather their herds and make both crossings. Here they were joined by the other non-treaty bands, the Snake and Seven Devils, Salmon River, and Clearwater. 10 days of the time remained, and they were almost in the boundary of the reservation. They decided to spend their last days of freedom in Rocky Canyon. There were dances, games, races, and parades. During this time, Joseph was called away to meet with another band farther beyond the Salmon. While he was gone, one of the Salmon River warriors decided to avenge his own father's death. His father had been killed by white settlers. He and two of his friends rode out and killed some white men. When Joseph returned, he heard the sound of war drums and knew that General Howard would hold him accountable for the trouble. He could no longer prevent the war he'd worked so hard for several years to avoid. He knew that now the white soldiers would march against him. In the first encounter with the soldiers, he took a group of braves, and with his scouts carrying a white flag, he made one last attempt for peace. However, the soldiers answered with gunshots, and the war between the Nez Perce and the white troops began. A war which was to last about 3 months and cover a route of 1,800 miles. With 300 warriors, Joseph fought off the armed might of the United States Army, while leading the women, children, and old people of his tribe over a tortuous 1,800-mile trail towards Canada. He fought 11 battles with the Army, 5 of them major battles. Of these battles, Joseph won 3. One battle was fought to a draw while his people escaped, and he lost only one, the last. The journey and battles covering 3 states, Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana. The red circles show the route the Indians took. The filled-in circles represent the major battles, with the one where the soldiers were victorious shown in blue. The blue stars show the progress of General Howard and his troops. The green dashes show where other troops were brought in. The major battles were fought at Whitebird, Clearwater, Big Hole, Canyon Creek, and Bear Paw Mountains. The Nez Perce fought a clean battle all of the way, but it was hard for Joseph's young warriors to understand why they should observe rules that the white man violated. They took no scalps, let captive women go free, and fought with almost scientific skill. In daring night raids, they would drive off the enemy's horses so that they couldn't pursue them. Or Joseph would send a few warriors out dragging brush to resemble traveling people and get the soldiers to follow. Meanwhile, his people would escape in another direction. When passage through the Bitterroot Mountains was blocked at Lolo Pass by soldiers with a barricade, the young men of the tribe built a ramp up a steep cliff to an old Indian trail which led to the Bitterroot Valley. At one time, Joseph even caused the pursuing columns to become confused and run into each other. Joseph and his people would have made their escape into Canada and the safety of Sitting Bull's camp if the telegraph wires of the white man had not been so efficient. By this means, General Howard was able to summon troops from other parts of the country. These new troops were able to track down the Nez Perce, while General Howard's troops were often 1 to 4 or more days behind them. General Miles's troops from Georgia surrounded and cut the Nez Perce off from safety when they were about 30 miles or another day's journey from Canada. The battle had been going on for about 2 days before General Howard and a few of his men, who were traveling faster than the main troops, arrived. During the early part of this battle, about half of Joseph's people escaped toward Canada. Among them was his daughter Sarah. No word was ever heard from them. It isn't known whether they escaped or died from exposure and starvation on the prairie. General Miles, who came to have only admiration for Joseph and his people, described the surrender which followed the Bear Paw battle. Joseph came up to the crest of the hill upon which stood General Howard, General Miles, an interpreter, and an aide. He was mounted, and 5 of his principal men pressed close to his horse. As he approached the spot where the generals were standing, the 5 men halted, and Joseph rode forward alone, leaped from his horse, and strode toward the soldiers. He handed his rifle to General Howard, who motioned him to deliver it to General Miles, which Joseph did. Standing back, he folded his blanket across his chest, leaving one arm free, and turning toward the interpreter said, "Tell General Howard I know his heart. What he told me before in Idaho, I have it in my heart. I am tired of fighting. My people ask me for food, and I have none to give. It is cold, and we have no blankets, no wood. My people are starving to death. Where is my little daughter? I do not know. Perhaps even now she is freezing to death. Hear me, my chiefs. I have fought, but from where the sun now stands, Joseph will fight no more forever." Joseph asked that he and his people be allowed to go back to the reservation which had been provided for them at Lapwai, Idaho. General Miles promised him that it would be allowed. However, General Miles was not allowed to keep this promise. The War Department chose to disregard his promise, and the group, now numbering less than 450 individuals, were first taken to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and later to the Indian Territory of Oklahoma. In 1883, a small part of women and children were allowed to return to their former homes in the Wallowa Valley, and during the following year they were joined by over 100 others. In 1885, Chief Joseph, the leaders of the tribe, and those that took an active part in the Nez Perce War were sent to the Colville Reservation in Washington State. No supplies were provided for them. They marched from Indian Territory to their new home and arrived on the edge of winter in a destitute condition, experiencing great suffering. In 1900, Joseph was allowed to visit his beloved valley of the Wallowa, but he was never allowed to return there to live. As for their beautiful horses, they were taken away and sold until they became an almost forgotten breed. The last words of Joseph were, "We gave up all our horses, and we have not heard of them since. Somebody has got our horses." Time passed. In 1937, Francis Haynes, a student in Idaho, was prying into the history of the Nez Perce Indians. In the midst of his searching, he suddenly became aware that the horses of the Nez Perce were occupying all his thoughts. He began digging deeper into the past and traced the Appaloosas from China and Persia. From Asia, they were taken to Spain, and then to Mexico, and finally to the Pacific Northwest. He decided that he just couldn't stand by and let a breed that had survived wars and centuries to die out. He sat down at his typewriter and pounded out words that had a sting to them. They roused horsemen who scoured the valleys, plains, and mountain hideouts. They found a few of the spotted horses, and once again, horsemen began to sort and cull and breed, only the best to the best. Today, the almost lost breed is about 100,000 strong. They are no longer buffalo runners. They are the range horses of the cattle country and the champion show horses of the horse shows today. The descendants of the gallant Nez Perce are now living quietly and peaceably on the Lapwai Reservation. One day a year at the National Appaloosa Show, a young brave is sometimes asked to mount a red or blue Paloosie, decorated with a saddle pad and bridle once belonging to Chief Joseph. Then a strong and joyous feeling comes over the spectators, white and Indian alike. It is almost as if the chieftain had come alive for this occasion. The memory of Chief Joseph will live forever in the hearts of his people and in the hearts of others who have had the opportunity of knowing him through history.